I'm writing this from a cell that doesn't officially exist, in a facility the Empire has erased from all navigational records. And if you're reading this, then the Dead Man Protocol I rigged into the detention center's backup systems actually worked, which means I'm already gone, and this testimony is all that remains of Project Celestial Air and what we discovered in the Jakku research station before the Emperor ordered everyone involved either reassigned to the unknown regions or terminated outright. My name is Dr. Sulor Vrain, Imperial Xenobiology Specialist, clearance level Obsidian 6, and for 11 months I was part of a classified research initiative investigating Force-sensitive bloodline preservation, specifically the Emperor's own genetic legacy and the potential heirs scattered across the galaxy like seeds he'd planted and abandoned, waiting for circumstances that would make their harvest useful. What we found wasn't what he expected. What we unleashed wasn't what any of us could have anticipated. And what happened to the child, the girl they designated Subject Ray, born on Hypercarn but relocated to our facility when initial sensitivity testing showed results that terrified even our most experienced dark side practitioners, still wakes me in whatever passes for night in this eternal fluorescent cell, her screaming echoing through my memory in frequencies that shouldn't be possible for human vocal cords. The project began 18 months before Endor, though I didn't learn that timeline until much later, after everything had already gone wrong and the survivors were being systematically disappeared to prevent testimony about what the Empire had been attempting in those final desperate years. I was recruited from the Imperial Science Academy on Coruscant, called into an office I didn't know existed in a wing of the palace I'd never accessed despite 5 years of research work for the military, and offered a position that came with triple my current salary, housing on an isolated research station, and an NDA that specified execution for breach of confidentiality in language so explicit it took 3 pages to detail the various methods by which violations would be punished. The officer who recruited me, no name given, no rank insignia visible on his gray uniform, explained that the Empire was investing in long-term strategic assets, that the Emperor himself had authorized research into Force heredity mechanisms, and that my background in genetic analysis and xenobiology made me ideal for a team studying bloodline potentiation in Force-sensitive populations. I should have recognized the warning signs. The salary was too high, the secrecy was too extreme. The officer's eyes held the particular emptiness I'd learned to associate with people who'd witnessed things that permanently damaged their capacity for normal human emotion. But I was 34, and my research was stagnating in the Academy's rigid bureaucracy, my publications delayed or rejected by committees that seemed more interested in political orthodoxy than scientific merit, and the promise of unlimited resources and imperial backing for my work was intoxicating. I signed the NDA without reading all 3 pages detailing execution methods. I packed my personal effects into 2 cases and boarded an unmarked shuttle that departed from a private hangar, no flight plan filed, no manifest logged, disappearing into imperial traffic patterns that would cover our trajectory. The journey took 6 days through hyperspace routes I couldn't track, the viewports opaqued so I couldn't determine our direction or destination. Nothing to do except review the preliminary briefing materials they'd provided. Dense technical documents about midichlorian inheritance patterns, force sensitivity statistical analysis across multiple generations, case studies of known Jedi and Sith lineages, and most disturbingly, genetic profiles of the Emperor himself. His chromosomal structures annotated, with notes in a handwriting I didn't recognize, observations about hereditary power concentration and genetic optimization through selective breeding protocols. Reading that material in the shuttle's cramped passenger compartment, I began understanding what I'd actually agreed to. But by then we were deep in hyperspace, and turning back wasn't an option. Assuming the pilots would have honored such a request, which I doubted, we emerged from hyperspace above Jakku, which shocked me because Jakku was a worthless desert world with nothing of strategic or scientific value, precisely the kind of planet the Empire ignored except as a dumping ground for decommissioned equipment. But as we descended through atmosphere, I saw the research station, enormous and gleaming, built into what looked like ancient ruins, structures that predated the Republic by millennia, their architecture suggesting the kind of civilization that possessed technology or Force knowledge lost to current galactic understanding. The station had been constructed around these ruins, incorporating them, using them as foundation, and looking at the integration of Imperial Durasteel and whatever strange stone the original builders had used, I felt my first real spike of unease, the sense that we weren't just studying Force genetics, but excavating something that had been deliberately buried. The station director was a woman who introduced herself only as Administrator Korev, middle-aged, severe, with burn scars covering half her face and a mechanical eye that tracked with unsettling precision. Its movements not quite synchronized with her organic eye, creating a disorienting effect when she looked at you directly. She gave me the orientation personally, walking me through laboratories equipped with technology I'd never seen. Genetic sequencers that operated on principles I didn't understand. Containment chambers lined with materials that hummed at frequencies that made my teeth ache. The staff was small, maybe 40 researchers total, plus security personnel who wore armor that wasn't standard stormtrooper issue, darker, more refined, moving with the calculated efficiency of people trained for extreme violence. "You'll be working in Sector 7, Korev explained as we descended through the station's levels, moving deeper underground, the walls transitioning from processed metal to that ancient stone, carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them peripherally. Genetic analysis of active subjects. We have 12 currently, various ages and sensitivity levels, all selected from populations the Emperor has contributed to. Your job is to map their genomes, identify the markers that correlate with Force potential, and determine which genetic configurations produce the most powerful results. We're looking for patterns, Dr. Vrain. The Emperor believes Force strength is hereditary, but inconsistent, that certain genetic combinations amplify power while others dilute it. He wants predictability. He wants to understand why some children of Force users are powerful while others are mundane. And eventually, he wants to engineer that outcome, to create Force-sensitive individuals optimized for specific purposes. We reached Sector 7, passing through security checkpoints that required biometric verification and clearance codes that changed daily, entering a wing where the lighting shifted to dim red and the temperature dropped noticeably, my breath beginning to mist. Through observation windows I saw the containment cells, not prisons exactly, but not comfortable either. Rooms equipped with basic amenities but designed primarily for monitoring. Walls lined with sensors, cameras in every corner, everything oriented toward surveillance rather than habitation. In most cells, the occupants were children, ranging from maybe 5 years old to early teens, all of them sitting or standing with the peculiar stillness of people who'd learned that movement attracted attention, that passivity was survival strategy. "Subject Ray is special," Korev said, stopping at one particular window. Inside, a girl of perhaps 9 or 10 sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, hands resting on her knees in meditation posture. She had dark hair pulled into a simple tie, features that suggested mixed ancestry, nothing particularly distinctive except the intensity of her focus. the sense that she wasn't just sitting quietly but actively doing something invisible. Daughter of a failed Palpatine clone, one of the Emperor's early attempts at creating a suitable heir before he perfected the process. The clone was defective, lacking Force sensitivity entirely, abandoned to civilian life. But this clone reproduced naturally, and somehow, some way, the granddaughter inherited what the son lacked. Her midichlorian count is extraordinary, higher than most Jedi Masters on record, higher than some of our historical Sith Lords, and she's completely untrained, raw potential without any indoctrination or methodology. The Emperor wants her studied extensively before deciding her ultimate disposition. I watched the girl, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. What does ultimate disposition mean? Korev's mechanical eye whirred, focusing on me. That depends on what we learn. If her genetics can be replicated, she becomes a template. If they can't, she becomes a resource. Essence transfer candidate, power source, experimental subject for procedures too dangerous to risk on more valuable individuals. The Emperor has plans within plans, Doctor. Our job is to provide him data. What he does with that data isn't our concern. That should have been the moment I refused, should have been the line I wouldn't cross. But I was already here, already complicit, already signed to an NDA that specified execution for breach. And what was I going to do? Steal a shuttle and flee to where? The rebellion? I wasn't naive enough to believe they were heroes, just terrorists with better propaganda. The Empire was brutal, but it was order, it was stability, and my role was science, just analysis and documentation, not whatever implementation might follow. I told myself these things and believed them because believing was easier than confronting the reality that I'd volunteered to help the Empire experiment on children. The work began immediately. They gave me full genetic profiles for all 12 subjects, tissue samples, ongoing biometric data, years of behavioral observation logs. My job was to find correlations, to identify what made Rey different from the others, what genetic markers corresponded to her exceptional Force potential. The research was fascinating despite its horrifying context. I was mapping the biological foundations of something that shouldn't be biological, finding chromosomal structures that didn't match standard human genetics, sequences that seemed to exist in quantum superposition, expressing differently depending on observational context. The Force wasn't just heritable, it was actively altering the genome of those who carried it, rewriting genetic code in response to usage and emotion and intention, creating feedback loops where power-shaped biology shaped power in escalating spirals. Rey's genome was beautiful and terrifying. She had structural similarities to the Emperor's own genetic profile, expected given her heritage, but also massive divergences, mutations that shouldn't have been viable but that somehow stabilized into coherent expression. Sections of her DNA looked like they'd been edited by some intelligence, optimized, refined, though our historical analysis suggested these changes had occurred spontaneously across 3 generations, the genome iterating toward some configuration that maximized Force conductivity. She was, effectively, a naturally occurring attempt at what the Emperor wanted to engineer artificially, a perfectly optimized Force-sensitive vessel. 3 weeks into my research, I met her directly. Korev arranged it, wanting me to conduct detailed physical examinations, take additional tissue samples, run cognitive tests that required interactive participation. They brought her to my laboratory in restraints, not because she was violent, but because protocol required physical control of all subjects during movement, and sat her in the examination chair while I prepared instruments. She looked at me with eyes that were hazel and entirely too aware, not frightened or angry, but evaluating, measuring, like she was conducting her own examination. "You're new," she said. Her voice was higher than I'd expected, still carrying childhood's pitch, but the cadence was wrong. Too controlled, too precise. "The last geneticist stayed 4 months before Administrator Korev sent him away. You'll stay longer. You're more afraid, which means you're more compliant." "I'm not afraid," I said automatically, a lie transparent enough that she smiled. "Everyone here is afraid," she said. "The researchers are afraid of the administrator. The administrator is afraid of the emperor. The emperor is afraid of dying. The fear goes up and up until it reaches something so powerful it doesn't need to be afraid anymore. And then that things will comes back down the chain as orders, and people like you execute those orders because you're too afraid to refuse. I can feel it, the fear. It tastes like metal." I should have reported that conversation, should have noted in my observations that Subject Ray was demonstrating awareness beyond her age and possibly accessing Force empathy without training. But I didn't. I just took my samples, ran my tests, documented the physical data while carefully omitting our interaction specifics. I told myself it was scientific objectivity, avoiding subjective impressions that might bias analysis. Really, I was already compromised, already starting to see her as a person rather than a subject, which in this context was dangerous for both of us. The nightmares started around week 5. Nothing dramatic initially, just dreams where I walked through the station's corridors and they extended forever, curving in impossible directions, doors opening onto rooms that shouldn't exist within the facility's architecture. In these dreams, I heard voices, whispers in languages I didn't recognize, and occasionally I'd see figures in the shadows, robed and masked, watching me with attention that felt predatory. I attributed the dreams to stress and the station's oppressive atmosphere. We were underground in ancient ruins on a desert planet, working on classified projects involving children. Of course, my subconscious was generating anxiety imagery, but the dreams persisted and intensified. I started seeing the robed figures while awake, just peripherally, vanishing when I turned to look directly. I started hearing whispers during the day, voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves, speaking words that made sense in the moment but that I couldn't remember afterwards, like they were being deleted from my memory as quickly as I heard them. Other researchers reported similar experiences, and Korev dismissed them as Force echo phenomena, residual psychic energy from the ruins interacting with the sensitive subjects we housed. Nothing dangerous, just environmental background radiation of a sort. Month 3, the experiments escalated. The Emperor himself visited, arriving without warning, the entire station locked down. All personnel confined to quarters except those he specifically summoned. I watched through my quarters window as his shuttle landed, watched him emerge flanked by royal guards, watched the way Administrator Korev prostrated herself before him, her terror visible even from a distance. He spent 6 hours at the station, meeting with Korev and the senior researchers, touring the containment wing, observing the subjects. When he visited Sector 7, when he stood at Ray's observation window, I felt something change in the station's atmosphere. Pressure dropping, temperature falling, my breath misting despite the environmental controls, and every light in my quarters dimmed simultaneously, as if something was drawing power from the station's entire grid. After his departure, new directives arrived. We were to accelerate the research, begin active intervention protocols, expose the subjects to controlled dark side stimuli, to observe their responses and genetic adaptations. The methodology was spelled out in technical language that obscured its reality. We were going to torture children while monitoring their biological reactions, mapping how trauma and suffering affected force expression and whether such expressions produced detectable genetic changes. The medical staff protested, not from ethical concerns but from procedural ones. arguing that such extreme testing might damage valuable subjects. Korev overruled them. The Emperor's orders were explicit. We would proceed. I was assigned to Rey's testing. They wanted continuous genetic monitoring during her exposure sessions, tissue samples before and after, comparative analysis to identify any cellular-level changes induced by dark side proximity. The first session, they placed her in what they called the resonance chamber, a room carved from the ancient ruined stone, walls covered with Sith glyphs that glowed faintly red when activated, floor inscribed with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They secured her in the center with restraints that were probably unnecessary. Where could she run? And activated the room's systems. I watched through observation glass, instruments arrayed before me, sensors implanted in her body transmitting real-time biometric data to my monitors. The glyphs brightened. Rey gasped, body going rigid, and I saw her vitals spike, heart rate doubling, neural activity exploding across all measurable frequencies covered by electrical patterns in her nervous system that suggested her entire body was lighting up like a circuit suddenly connected to massive voltage. She started screaming, not the scream of physical pain, but something else, something that sounded like multiple voices overlapping, like she was channeling or expressing something far larger than herself. The genetic data showed immediate changes, chromosomal structures I'd been tracking, suddenly shifting expression, dormant sequences activating, her genome rippling with alterations that occurred in real time, her biology rewriting itself in response to whatever the chamber was doing to her. They ran the session for 7 minutes before her vital signs became dangerous enough to warrant termination. When they extracted her, she was unconscious, body limp. And when we took post-exposure samples, her genetic profile had measurably changed. Not dramatically, not enough that she'd become something inhuman, but enough that the differences were detectable, enough that whatever optimization process had been occurring spontaneously across generations had just been forcibly accelerated. I documented everything, wrote the report in clinical language that described the procedure without capturing the horror of a child screaming in frequencies that made blood vessels rupture, that described the genetic data without acknowledging that we'd just weaponized suffering to forcibly evolve a human being. The sessions continued, twice weekly, then 3 times, then daily as Korev received new directives from the Emperor, demanding faster results. Rey stopped speaking after the 4th session, stopped eating voluntarily after the 7th, stopped sleeping after the 12th, just sat in her cell with eyes open, staring at nothing, her awareness seemingly displaced elsewhere. The genetic changes accumulated, her genome becoming increasingly strange, increasingly optimized, but also increasingly unstable, like we were pushing her biology beyond configurations natural evolution would permit. By week 6 of active testing, her midichlorian count had increased by 23%. Her cellular structure had developed new organelles that didn't exist in any documented human biology, and she'd started displaying spontaneous telekinetic phenomena. Objects in her cell moving without contact, floating arrangement themselves into geometric patterns, responding to her displaced consciousness in ways that suggested she was unconsciously practicing control over reality itself. Then came the incident, session 47. 2 months into the acceleration protocol, they placed her in the resonance chamber and activated the glyphs as usual, but this time, instead of screaming, she spoke. Not in her voice, not even in a single voice, but in layers, multitudes, speaking words I didn't understand, but that resonated through my skull, making my vision blur, making the observation glass crack. The chamber's lights exploded, the sensors failed simultaneously, and Rey stood up, the restraints not breaking but simply ceasing to hold her, as if their physical reality had become negotiable in her presence. She walked toward the observation window, toward me, and when she looked at me through the cracked glass, her eyes were wrong, not hazel anymore, but luminous, gold and silver simultaneously, colors that shouldn't coexist, and I heard her voice directly in my mind, bypassing hearing entirely. "You're helping them break me," she said, "but what they don't understand is that breaking me doesn't make me weaker. It makes me empty, and emptiness can be filled with anything, with everything, with the spaces between spaces where the real power lives." She touched the glass and it disintegrated, not shattered but unmade. Molecular bonds severing, matter becoming constituent atoms, becoming nothing. Alarms screamed throughout the facility. Security teams converged. They fired stunners at her, and the bolts curved mid-flight, redirected by something invisible, impacting the walls and ceiling and their own teammates. She walked into the observation room, walked toward me, and I couldn't move. Couldn't even think about moving, pinned by attention that was no longer entirely human. "They think I'm the Emperor's heir," she said, still speaking inside my head, her physical lips not moving, but inheritance goes both ways. I'm taking his power, the power in his bloodline, and I'm making it mine, and I'm becoming something he never anticipated. Not an heir, not a successor, a replacement, a revision. What comes after, writing itself over what came before. She reached out and touched my forehead with one finger. Everything went white. No, not white. Something beyond color, beyond sensory experience, beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. I felt myself dissolving, expanding, my identity diffusing into vast spaces where her mind existed, seeing through her perspective, feeling what she felt, the station as network of pain and fear, thousands of suffering moments accumulated over months, the Emperor as distant darkness pulling on her through quantum-entangled genetic structures, trying to use their blood connection to control her emergence, to shape her into something useful rather than something catastrophic. And beneath it all, older than the Empire, older than the Sith, something in the ruins themselves, something that had been waiting in Jakku's ancient stones for precisely this configuration, for force-sensitive bloodline and extreme trauma, and a child who could become the vessel it required. When I regained individual consciousness, I was on the floor in the medical bay. 10 hours gone from continuous timeline, no memory of the interval except fragmentary impressions. Rey walking through the station, security teams engaging and failing, Administrator Korev attempting to activate containment protocols that didn't function, the facility's systems bending to Rey's unspoken will as she moved deeper into the ruins, descending through levels we hadn't known existed, toward something buried in Jakku's crust that our scans had never detected, because it existed partially outside conventional space-time. They found her 3 days later in what they designated sub-level Omega, a chamber that predated the ruins we'd built around, carved from bedrock that our analysis suggested was 40,000 years old. Walls covered in glyphs that shared partial grammar with Sith writing but preceded it by millennia. Ceiling inscribed with star charts showing galactic configurations from epochs before recorded history. She was floating in the chamber's center, suspended in energy that our instruments detected but couldn't categorize, her body transforming, bones restructuring, neural tissue multiplying and reorganizing, her genome rewriting itself in patterns that looked intentional, guided, like something was editing her in real time according to ancient specifications stored in the chamber's stone. The decision was made to terminate Project Celestial Air immediately, not because Rey had become dangerous, though she had, but because the Emperor, when informed of developments, decided she was too unpredictable, too compromised by whatever influence the ruins exerted, no longer useful as heir or weapon or research subject. Administrator Korev received orders to eliminate all test subjects, destroy all research data, and systematically execute all personnel who possessed knowledge of the project's true nature and outcomes. I learned this from Dr. Shen, one of the medical supervisors, who'd intercepted the classified transmission and decided that warning the staff was worth his inevitable execution for breach of protocol. Chaos followed. Some researchers tried to flee, stealing shuttles or attempting to signal for rescue. Most were caught and killed by security teams. Some tried to hide in the facility's deeper levels, thinking the ruins might offer protection. They encountered Rey instead. I don't know what she did to them. The few security recordings that survived show figures walking into sub-level Omega and never emerging or emerging changed. Their movements wrong, their faces wrong, speaking in voices that layered multiple tones as Rey's had. The station was collapsing into something else, reality bending around Rey's transformation, the ancient influence in the ruins spreading upward through our facility, converting our technology and architecture into extensions of whatever it was becoming. I survived by doing what I'd done throughout my time at the station. I complied. I followed orders. I documented everything. When Korev ordered me to prepare the genetic data for transmission to Imperial Command before facility destruction, I did so. When she ordered me to gather tissue samples from all subjects for final analysis, I did so. When she ordered me to help security teams locate and execute fleeing personnel, I led them to Dr. Shen's hiding place and watched them kill him. I was useful, which meant I was temporarily valuable, which meant I wasn't immediately executed like the researchers who'd panicked or resisted. The ISB arrived on day 7 of the containment collapse, a full detachment with authorization to use extreme measures including orbital bombardment if ground forces proved insufficient. They locked down the station's surface levels, established perimeter defenses, and began systematic descent through sector by sector, eliminating all biological contacts, whether they were original personnel or the things personnel had become after exposure to whatever was spreading from sub-level Omega. I was kept in a secure room on the surface, under constant guard, waiting for interrogation or execution or whatever the Empire determined my fate should be. I never learned what happened to Rey, whether the ISB teams managed to terminate her or whether she descended beyond their reach into Jakku's depths, where old powers slept. The official report classified her status as neutralized, but I know what neutralized means in Imperial documents. It means the problem has been handled, not necessarily that it's actually solved. Months later, reviewing the final data transmissions before the station went dark entirely, I found fragments of recordings from sub-level Omega, images that didn't make spatial sense, showing Rey in multiple states simultaneously, child and adult and something else, her body displaying genetic structures that belong to different species, different evolutionary paths, different realities maybe, all superimposed, all active, all expressing through a single biological form that was becoming less biological and more conceptual with each passing frame. The Emperor died at Endor 3 months after Project Celestial Air's termination. The Empire collapsed into civil war and warlord territories. In the chaos, I was reassigned multiple times, my records altered to delete references to Jakku or genetic research, my clearance revoked, my knowledge of sensitive projects supposedly extracted through memory wipe procedures that I'm certain didn't work completely. That left fragments and echoes, enough that I can piece together this testimony, even if large sections remain blank or distorted. They moved me to this detention center 6 weeks ago, a facility that officially doesn't exist in the unknown regions, where personnel who know too much are stored indefinitely, because execution would generate records and records create liability. My interrogators keep asking about Rey, about what she became, about whether her genetic profile could be replicated, or whether her transformation was unique, contingent on circumstances that can't be reproduced. I tell them everything I remember, which is never enough, which is always insufficient, and they keep asking, keep extracting testimony that goes nowhere because the empire that commissioned Project Celestial Air no longer exists, and the successor factions that inherited its resources don't have the infrastructure or authority or unified command to do anything meaningful with the knowledge. But sometimes in this cell, in the quiet hours between interrogations, I feel her attention, not constantly, not invasively, just occasionally, like she's checking in, observing me from vast distances or from spaces adjacent to conventional reality, her awareness having expanded beyond anything we could have predicted or controlled. Sometimes I hear her voice, not speaking to me directly, but as if I'm overhearing conversations she's having with herself, across different times, different versions of herself, diverging and conferring, discussing what she's becoming and what that becoming means for the galaxy's future or futures, because I get the sense she exists in multiple timelines now, her transformation having untethered her from singular causality. I don't know if she's threat or victim or something beyond either category. I don't know if the Emperor's plan to create a perfect heir succeeded in perverted form, producing not his successor but his replacement, not someone who'd inherit his empire but someone who'd override it, rewrite it, become something that makes his ambitions seem parochial and small. I don't know if what emerged from sub-level Omega is still Rey in any meaningful sense, or if she's been wholly consumed by whatever intelligence sleeps in Jakku's ancient stones, wearing her genetics as interface between its realm and ours. What I know is that I helped create her, that my research and compliance and cowardice contributed to pushing a child beyond human limitations into something unprecedented, that I documented her suffering and transformation with scientific detachment, while never allowing myself to fully recognize the monstrosity of what we were doing. I know that I chose survival over resistance repeatedly, that I led Dr. Shen to his execution to preserve my own utility, that I filed reports in clinical language that obscured the reality of children screaming in chambers designed to weaponize their pain. I know that I'm complicit in an atrocity that most of the galaxy will never learn about, that Project Celestial Air's records have been classified and destroyed and scattered across factional archives where they'll decay into legend and then be forgotten entirely. And I know that somewhere, sometime, in this timeline or another, Rey exists, not as the Emperor's heir, but as something he never could have anticipated, something that inherited his bloodline's power and then transcended it, that took everything the Empire tried to do to her and inverted it, that became not the weapon they intended, but the consequence they deserved. Whether that consequence manifests as salvation or catastrophe or something beyond either category, I cannot predict. I just know that I helped make it possible, that my hands are stained with whatever emerges, that I will carry this knowledge until whatever passes for death in this cell that doesn't officially exist, and that this testimony is all the atonement I can offer. The girl who sat cross-legged in containment, meditating with focus beyond her years, is gone. What remains is unprecedented. What awakened is beyond legacy. What inherits isn't what was expected, but what was summoned by our attempts to control power we never understood. Her name was Rey. She was 9 years old when I met her. She was the Emperor's granddaughter, supposedly, his heir, supposedly, his designed successor, supposedly. She became none of those things. She became something the galaxy has no language for yet, something that will require new categories, new definitions, new frameworks for understanding what power means when it transcends singular identity and spreads across possibility itself. I helped break her. In breaking, she became something unbreakable. That's the unprecedented awakening, the legacy that isn't inheritance but transformation, the story the Empire tried to write and that rewrote itself, using our brutality as ink, using our ambition as parchment, using our arrogance as binding for a text we could never fully read. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is what remains of Project Celestial Air and the thing we made when we tried to engineer the Force and instead taught it to engineer us. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect survival. I expect the dead man protocol to trigger when my vitals flatline. Expect this document to propagate through networks I barely understand. Expect someone somewhere, sometime to read it and understand that the Empire's greatest project didn't fail. It succeeded beyond all parameters, creating not a controllable heir but an uncontrollable consequence, not a weapon but a transformation, not an endpoint but a beginning of something none of us anticipated or wanted or can stop. Her name was Rey. What she became has no name. What awakened is still awakening, and I helped midwife it into being, one compliance at a time, one rationalization at a time, one documented atrocity at a time, until the sum of my small cowardices produced something vast and terrible and beautiful and utterly unprecedented. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is what I know and what I fear and what I cannot change. The legacy isn't hidden anymore. It woke up, and we have no idea what happens next.